Good afternoon and welcome to the Economic Growth Center's 35th Kuznets lecture. I'm Rohini Pandey, a professor in the economics department and also the director of the Economic Growth Center. I'd also like to welcome those joining online. The talk today is being live streamed and recorded. For those attending in person, please note that by being here, you agree to have your comments being recorded and presented publicly. This annual Simon Kuznets lecture honors the legacy of Nobel Prize-winning economist Simon Kuznets. Post-World War II, Kuznets saw a need for a center to do what he believed his home institutions were not able to do, to use data to understand development. He believed Yale was the ideal home for such a venture, and he worked with the then chair of the economics department and the Ford Foundation to set up the Economic Growth Center in 1961. Today, the Economic Growth Center is the hub of quantitative research in economic development and trade at Yale, and the Kuznets lecture is our flagship lecture. The Kuznets lecture began in 1987 and is dedicated to quantitative aspects of the economic growth of nations. The title Kuznets gave to his pioneering series of 10 short monographs. He dedicated the final 2 monographs, notably part 9 and 10, to analyzing the level and structure of foreign trade over the long term. We are thrilled that Professor Doug Irwin from Dartmouth today will be talking about some of these issues. I will now hand it over to my colleague, Professor Leah Bustan, to introduce Doug.
Doug Irwin is the John French Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College. And I think it's fair to say that Doug is the foremost expert on trade policy in economic history. Of course, this means that in the past few years, Doug has been very busy explaining to the media and the public what the past can teach us about current events. So we're very grateful to have some of Doug's time today. Doug is the author of, by my count, 6 books, though I may have lost count, including this Bible, Clashing Over Commerce, A History of US Trade Policy. I highly recommend that those of you who don't have this book, buy this book, and you will have a full summer project. And I will say that this book, Clashing Over Commerce, was selected as a best book of the year by The Economist and Foreign Affairs magazine in 2017. Doug has served the public as well by working on the Council of Economic Advisors and in the International Finance Division at the Fed Board of Governors. For this distinguished career of scholarship and service, Doug was recently elected president of the Economic History Association. And I can think of no more fitting candidate to address us as the 2026 Kuznets lecturer. So please join me in giving Doug a warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. If you look at this title, it may be a little bit boring, but I think there's a Yale angle here that I'll mention in just a moment. But let me just begin by saying that I want to leave you with 3 points over the next hour or so. What we saw happen in the world economy in the 1980s and 90s is historic and changed the face of the globe and changed the face of the world economy as we know it. And I'm talking about centuries, not just decades in terms of its importance. Second, how did this happen? How did the world economy get opened in such a way? Overcoming overvalued currencies and exchange rates, I think, was a key to the process that unlocked the ability to reduce other trade barriers. How did that happen? I think it was changing ideas among policymakers that accomplished this tremendous task. Now, here, in a way to ingratiate myself with the local audience, I will say that Yale helped change the world, and I will, at various points throughout the talk about how Yale economists and others contributed to this process that we observed over the 1980s and 90s. But first, let me, of course, pay tribute to the person for whom this lecture is named, Simon Kuznets. Of course, all economists know him, Nobel Prize winner, helped invent national income accounting, worked at the NBER, tremendous work on quantitative economic history. And of course, he had a very famous quip, which I have here, is when he said that there are 4 types of economies, or 4 economies. There's developed countries, developing countries, Japan, and Argentina. And that reflected the world in which he saw, that there really was this separation. There was not migration between these groups. There were only two, Argentina, which went this way, and Japan, which went the other way. But there weren't many other transitions. But of course, in graduate school, we were exposed to a lot of his work. It wasn't just Solow when it came to growth. It was Kuznets as well in terms of the numbers and trying to quantify structural change and the evolution of the growth process. But as Rohini mentioned, he had a number of papers where he talked about trade. And this is one I definitely remember reading in graduate school. It was very long, but he brought together an abundance of data on the importance of trade for various countries, going back as far as you possibly could into the 19th century. And it really was a pioneering effort to bring things together so we understood these long-term historical trends. Now, he didn't exactly put it this way, but this is the way we modern economic historians would look at it. And what is this? This is world trade to world GDP. So it's a very imperfect measure of global integration, if you will, or the extent to which countries are trading relative to the size of their economies. And this is sort of the world that Kuznets knew. It's relatively stable. We see a slight rise in the late 19th century, a decline in the interwar period, post-war recovery, but it's sort of stable in some sense. And this is the data that Kuznets was working with. What I want to talk about is the world after Kuznets, where we see this, a tremendous explosion in world trade relative to world GDP. And in particular, it's concentrated between those two lines, between the mid-1980s up to the global financial crisis, when we see this tremendous rise. Now, over the course of my career, I've sort of observed this and seen this. But for you, the students in this audience, you see that high level of integration that's no longer increasing. And so it's a very different world. But I want to go back a little bit in what is not history for me, but it is history for many of you, and see how did this process unfold. Here's how historic this period is. So let's go back to Adam Smith for a moment, because we are celebrating this month the 250th anniversary of the publication of The Wealth of Nations. And in that, he says, two of the greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind are, first, the discovery of America, and second, the passage to the East Indies through the Cape of Good Hope. Why? Why are those two of the most important events in world history? Because they're integrating different continents and different regions of the world in a way that we're integrated in terms of our land commerce, perhaps a little bit, but really become integrated with this reduction in transport costs. I think we could update Adam Smith and say the third most important and consequential development in the world economy is this recent integration process that I just showed you. And here's why it happened so fast in some sense. When I was in graduate school, as many of you are today, the world was trifurcated. There were three worlds, literally, and they were not well integrated. So we have the blue countries, the West. They were members of the GATT. They were democracies for the most part. They were market-oriented. They reduced trade barriers after World War II. Then we have the red countries, the second world, communist countries, which were closed off. We didn't trade a lot with China, Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union. And then there was the third world, the global South, in Latin America, Africa, and South Asia, which had high trade barriers, are not well integrated with the rest of the world. These were really, truly three separate blocks. This is the world as of 1985. Let's fast forward just 10 years, and what happens? Everyone's a member of the WTO. Everyone's moving in a market-oriented direction. Everyone is reducing their trade barriers, and the market has become a world market. And what's also remarkable is this tremendous opening of markets and this expansion of trade happened peacefully. Because once again, that's not the way it's happened in terms of history. So my good friends Ron Finley and Kevin O'Rourke, they wrote another wonderful book, Power and Plenty, and they say the greatest expansions of world trade have come not from the bloodless tantamount of the fictitious Walrasian auctioneer, but at the barrel of the Maxim gun, the ferocity of the scimitar, and the ferocity of the nomadic herdsman. In other words, by force and conquest. That's how trade has expanded in the past. And in case you don't know what a scimitar is, this is it. And it can be used to open markets if you so choose. But this happened largely peacefully. So that's another accomplishment. How did it happen? Countries voluntarily, unilaterally opened up their markets. And so if we look at the Sachs-Warner index of whether countries are open or closed, it's a very simple metric. Go to the 60s, not much happening. 70s, not much happening. Early 80s, not much happening. But then between 1985 and 95, there's this revolution in developing countries. They're beginning to open up. And of course, we're all aware of India, we're all aware of China, I'll talk about them. But it wasn't just them. It was many other countries in Latin America, South Asia, Africa, and elsewhere. And it's all concentrated in this period here. I asserted in the beginning that this was historic. And it is. So let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to 1800, before the Industrial Revolution, and look at world income distribution around 1800. And whether you can see that international poverty line, that thin line there, basically everyone's to the left of that. The world is desperately poor. And there's a small tail that's rich in the northwest corner of Western Europe, but otherwise most people are poor. Who tells us about this period? Yale. Joel Mokyr, who got his PhD here, and he reminds us, and if you ever had a chance to listen to him, do so, because he says it is the responsibility of economic historians to remind the world of what things were like before 1800. And what he will tell you is they were miserable before the Industrial Revolution. Harvest failure can kill millions. He's an impassioned scholar on this. But he's also an impassioned scholar, and of course he just won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution changed the course of history. And here's how it changed it in terms of income distribution. Boom, some countries got rich as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And this is fast forwarding a lot over the 19th century into the late 20th century. But what we see as of 1975 is a world of have and have-nots, of rich countries and poor countries. This is exactly the world Kuznets was describing. There's developed countries and developing countries. And there's not much transition between them. Countries on the right aren't moving down, and countries on the left aren't moving up to the right. What else is happening during this period? Well, either you industrialize, as Kuznets said, and got richer, or you didn't. And so global inequality is rising secularly from the Industrial Revolution. The world's only going one way. Either you've got it or you don't, and global inequality is going up. This is what Lant Pritchett, the development economist, says, divergence big time. The benefits of the Industrial Revolution are not spread around the world. Some countries have it, other countries don't. Rich, poor, north, south. There's something wrong with the system. This is poverty. Not much progress in the 20th century from 1900 to 1980. It's trending down a little bit, but it's very slow. It's terrible how many people are mired in desperate poverty. So let me invoke another Yaley, Paul Krugman, who was an undergraduate here and then came back for a short stint as assistant professor. This is, of course, the way he looks today. You're familiar with him from the New York Times and what have you. This is the way he looked back then, when he was a young undergraduate and what have you. But he wrote in the New York Times, the good news. What is the good news? First of all, this very much reflects my experience as well. Krugman says when he went to graduate school, and when he was an undergraduate here, he knew, he initially thought about specializing in development. There's no more important topic than how to raise the standards of living of the world's poor, as he says. But what did he say? He couldn't do it. He said in the 1970s, this is just too depressing. In fact, he says it should have been called non-development economics, because that's what Kuznets was noting. Poor countries are not catching up to the richer others. And what does he say? What we've seen, and he's writing in 2003, over the past generation is enormous, unexpected improvement in the human condition. Unexpected. I'll come back to that in a moment. How did this happen? Every one of those development success stories, he says, was based on export-led growth. That's that period that I'm talking about in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And here's how it changed the course of world history. Let's look at world income distribution. From 1975 to 2015, what happens? The whole distribution shifts to the right. And we no longer have rich and poor. We have a unimodal distribution. Here's where I wish I had Pete Schott as my RA, because we can look at what happens over time. When we shift this distribution over time, it's just amazing what happens. 3 outcomes from this. The creation of a global middle class. A global middle class, not just in the West. Astounding development. Fall in global inequality. Okay, so this is what I showed you before with this great divergence that Lant Pritchett noted. Boom. Here's what happened since late 1990s, early 2000s. We erased a century worth of growing international inequality in 20 years. Astounding, astounding historic development. Branko Milanovic has done a lot of work on this, and he says we've witnessed the greatest reshuffling of individual income positions since the Industrial Revolution. That's why it's historic, because of how it's changed things. And of course, we used to not have in Kuznets' day an unconditional convergence, but we began to get that in the 2010s, a great convergence. Now, it turns out that stopped, but also that trade ratio has stopped. And so we're not talking about the present so much, but that period in the past led to unprecedented global convergence. And of course, the reduction in global poverty, which you're all aware about. Here's why that Krugman used that term unexpected. Because if you just looked at the trend of global poverty, boom, it sort of falls way down after when? 1980s. And here's just another look at it. If you just projected the trend, you say slow, steady progress. But we made a lot more than slow and steady progress. Unfortunately, this also, as the Financial Times noted, until recently. So there's still work to be done. And once again, I think changes in the world economy are somewhat behind this. OK, so that raises the question, well, if export-led growth and the opening of the world economy led to so many of these things, how did that happen? How do you engineer export-led growth? How does that come? Well, here's where I think economists need to shift a little bit and focus on policy, because this is what we tend to do. We say, OK, there's some sort of policy change, and let's trace the outcome. OK, so you change your tariffs. What happens to wages? What happens to inequality? What happens to GDP? And what have you? That's all well and good, and it's very important. And I just want to briefly summarize that, because it's linked to all those other changes I was pointing out before. Many, many papers in this genre. Here's just one by a friend of mine, Alan Taylor, looking at this great liberalization. And they look at liberalizers and non-liberalizers. And lo and behold, the liberalizers do better. And after about 10 years, they enjoy 15 to 20% higher income. That's not the only study that shows the benefits here. Although they say, is there any other single policy recommendation that one can make that would lead to such a payoff? That's pretty substantial. There are a lot of synthetic control exercises as well. Here's a paper that goes through a whole bunch for different countries. Generally, there's an improvement. It varies depending on the country, of course. Here's one for India, for example, after the 1991 reforms, 25% higher income than some plausible counterfactual path. You can debate the numbers, but that's an improvement. I've done some work with a colleague of mine at Dartmouth, Jim Firer. We look at current account openness measures, and we find after 15 years, you get a payoff roughly the same that Alan Taylor and others find. So there are a lot of these studies. But here's, once again, Krugman's point about this as being unexpected. So if you'd looked at the evidence circa 1999 or 2000, and there's a famous paper by Rodriguez and Roderick on this, you'd say, actually, it's weak. We don't have much evidence that trade reform pays off in terms of higher incomes. I think the problem with this is that, first of all, this paper is written in 1999. I talked about this window between 85 and 95 when the reforms are taking place. If you're writing a paper in 1999 based on papers that are written in 1998, well, the reforms have just taken place. These take a little bit of time. So I decided to update things in 2025 and look at the evidence, which had accumulated over the next 25 years, and it's substantial. In fact, many of the papers that are documenting the impacts of globalization were done here at Yale. And I'll just call out Penny for tremendous work on this, and I cite her extensively in that paper because she's done so much of this. So this is what we tend to do, but here's sort of what I'm interested in, where I want to shift the conversation a little bit. Who did this? Why did they do it? How is it possible for them to change the state of economic policy? And this is sort of what I'm discovering as I investigate this. The who is the finance minister, sometimes the president of the central bank, which is odd because you don't think about them relative to trade policy. Why are they changing? Because they have a balance of payments crisis, because they've run out of foreign exchange. And what do? What are the policy levers they pull? They abolish foreign exchange controls. They abolish import licensing. They move to a more flexible exchange rate. So when we ask, how is this happening? The exchange rate turns out to be a key variable for unleashing some of these changes. So just some quotes that back this up. Keesing at the World Bank noted that all the success of the outward-oriented countries at this time It's really the exchange rate. They have a realistic competitive exchange rate. Bella Balassa says if we look at the policy reforms as of the mid-1980s, it's actually not import liberalization. It's really getting exchange rate has a central place involving a devaluation, what have you. And John Williamson, the author of the Washington Consensus, said that the single most important policy instrument in implementing outward orientation is the exchange rate. I'll call out here Bella Balassa, another Yaley, who is a PhD student here and then a professor, and he educated many students, who I'll come to in a moment, who actually implemented some of these policies. But I think focusing on the exchange rate gives us a different perspective on how this process unfolded. So when we look at outcomes, often we trade economists will look at plant-level productivity and say, oh, there's productivity benefits. When you focus on the exchange rate, what you find is that what this does is it stimulates exports and export earnings, and what that means is you can buy more imports. And that's how the technology gets transferred, just by buying more capital goods and expanding that budget. It's not even domestic competition per se, it's just buying more stuff. Reform. We always talk about tariffs, but really the devaluation is a key thing, and the elimination of the quantitative restrictions and the import licensing that accompany those, that overvalued currency. And really the underlying motivation is the country needs more foreign exchange. It can only get so by stimulating exports with a more flexible exchange rate regime and establishing a market in foreign exchange. This perspective is just also a little bit different in terms of how policy reform takes place, because when we economists talk about why is it that some countries are closed or have protectionist policies, we often talk about special interests. Okay, so the government maybe is welfare maximizing, but it's the special interests that get in the way, and there's a whole literature on this. You know, consumers don't organize, there's concentrated benefits for producers and diffuse costs among consumers, but there's also another motivation for trade policy intervention, not just at the behest of special interests. It's driven by balance of payments adjustment under fixed exchange rates. And what I see going on during this process of reform is that countries are using import controls as a substitute for devaluation. And ironically, that sort of made it easier for them to be removed in the 80s and 90s when these countries had these balance of payments crises, because they were not originally imposed at the behest of special interests. They were imposed in response to emergency conditions where countries were running out of foreign exchange, and therefore when things can change, those same technocrats can possibly undo them if they view devaluation as being a positive benefit. In addition, special interests aren't so important for so many of these reforms because all traded goods industries will benefit from a devaluation as opposed to a tariff cut where there's more sharply winners and losers. So this idea that the exchange rate and the exchange rate regime is very important for trade policy, we can trace that back to this period right here, the Great Depression, the implosion of trade during the interwar period. So I'm sure you're all aware in the 1930s there was this outbreak of protectionism. Here's the famous downward spiral of world trade, month after month trade contracting. I will note that John Maynard Keynes, writing in the Yale Review in 1933 said, you know what, the situation is messed up. Countries should just isolate themselves from the world economy. And so here's the New York Times reporting. He's advocating the Yale Review with a New Haven, Connecticut byline. Economic isolation, that policy is best for the present. That's sort of a pessimistic message. You know, the world economy is imploding, just hunker down and protect yourself. Fortunately, there was another Yale economist, Irving Fisher, who said, well, not so fast. Let's think about this depression. And he had this very famous paper, Are Booms and Depressions Transmitted Internationally Through Monetary Standards? In other words, the gold standard was the ultimate culprit here. And we ought to think about our relationship of our monetary system and our currency with respect to gold and not just go in for trade protection. This was followed up by another Yaley, Barry Eichengreen, who famously wrote Golden Fetters and really uncovered a lot in terms of the international transmission of the Great Depression. And one of his points is that when countries got off the gold standard, they began to recover, because they freed up monetary policy from the constraints of gold. So Barry and I teamed up and we said, well, does the gold standard have anything to do with the protectionism of this period? And yes, it does. The protectionism of the Great Depression was not so much driven by special interest groups demanding protection. It was countries imposing import restrictions to stem an outflow of gold as a result of the malfunctioning of the gold standard at the time. And in particular, an unwillingness of countries to depreciate their currency and devalue against gold. Those countries that did devalue tended not to impose as many trade restrictions. So if we just look at a scatter plot, say, of are you imposing quotas on trade? So on the y-axis is just the share of imports covered by these import restrictions of quotas. And here we have the exchange rate. So 100 means you stay on the gold standard. The more you depreciate your currency, the less you rely on quotas. You just don't need them because that balance of payments constraint is relieved. And then in the case of Germany, for example, there's this fear of devaluation because there's a fear of inflation. And so you stay on the gold standard. Gold's flowing out. You want to stop that, so you impose all sorts of exchange controls and restrictions. And if you're interested in economic history, just go to any issue of the Journal of Economic History, and you can find papers on devaluation, exports, and recovery from the Great Depression. That doesn't quite answer the question, why are countries worried about this outflow of gold? In fact, Barry didn't quite deal with that situation so much in his book, but here's what was going on. It's not as though the world's supply of gold was going down, but it was all being siphoned off by two countries, France and the United States. And they were not monetizing that gold, they were sterilizing it. So they were effectively depriving other countries of gold and enforcing deflationary policies on others, which was creating the distress. So most people have focused on the US here, but I decided to write a paper on France. And of course, to ask this question is to sort of answer it, because after all, I didn't say, did Papua New Guinea cause the Great Depression? France, do they have something to do with it? And yes, because they were siphoning off the gold and not monetizing it. And just as a fun fact here, when special forces raided bin Laden's compound in Pakistan, they also took all of his data, his hard drives, and his papers, and he had a whole bunch of material on France, and lo and behold, he had his paper, my paper in there, and that was right up there with France on radioactive waste management, 2008. Now, why Osama bin Laden was interested in this, I have no idea, but he was interested in France for whatever reason. So that's the Great Depression. Let's go forward to Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. You all know the 1944 conference that established fixed exchange rates. Here's Keynes and Henry Morgenthau. Established fixed exchange rates. But the post-war era was one of inflation. And if you're fixing your exchange rate, but pursuing high rates of inflation, you've got to have a nominal devaluation regularly to keep your real exchange rate in check. And there are two types of problems that countries were quickly running into. One is that many want to pursue policies of fiscal expansion, which is sort of incompatible with a fixed exchange rate, as we'll see. And also, other countries were facing big reductions in foreign aid in the 1950s and 60s, and that also created problems on this. So let's just, to fix ideas, let's just think of a market for foreign exchange, supply and demand. This is the peso price, or the domestic currency price of the dollar. So what that means is that when you're going up, that's a depreciation of your currency. As a famous finance minister in a developing country once said, the exchange rate's going through the floor. Okay, so the domestic currency price is going up, that's a depreciation. And then we have the export receipts and import spending on these two other axes. Export supply is responsive to a depreciation. Import demand is obviously related the other way. Let's say you ramp up fiscal spending, either for consumption purposes or investment. And so that increases the demand for imports. So what does that do? Well, first of all, if you keep the exchange rate fixed, now there's a gap between what you're going to be spending on imports and what your export earnings are. So there's a foreign exchange gap. And the question is, how do you make that up? You can make it, well, there's various ways you can do that, but it's sort of an issue with fixed exchange rates. Now, if you let the exchange rate go, you don't have a problem. The exchange rate depreciates, exports go up, imports are restricted, balance of payments balances. Okay, but if you keep it, if you go to this, if you keep that exchange rate fixed, and here I just rearrange things a little bit, and you have an E1 is the value of the exchange rate, so it's overvalued. The domestic currency price of foreign exchange is too low. You have that gap. And unless you can spend reserves to finance that gap, the temptation is going to be you've got to squeeze imports. You have to pursue a policy of import compression. You have to ration imports to get it down to X1, which is the value of your export earnings. So that's import compression. And what that does is it leads to rationing of those imports. You get a black market premium on the currency, so there's a shadow price, if you will, for the exchange rate. You're contracting economic activity, and so you have this deadweight loss. And you also create a tremendous rent for someone in the system where they get access to foreign exchange at a low price, but they can sell goods at a high price. We know this deadweight loss as the Harburger Triangle, not a Yale as far as I know. And we know the rent as Anne Kruger, Rent-Seeking Society, her famous paper, and she was, of course, delivered the Kuznets lecture a number of years ago. So in other words, the alternative to a devaluation is import compression and restriction of imports. And so the failure to adjust the nominal exchange rate can lead to big distortions. If you don't devalue, you're going to be led down the path of foreign exchange rationing, and that means you're going to have export surrender requirements, which means you require all exporters to hand over their foreign exchange earnings at the official rate, which is artificially low, to the central bank. The central bank then doles it out based on import licenses and things of that sort. And it can also, because the government will be allocating foreign exchange, leads to corruption, rent-seeking, all the things that Kruger was talking about. But here's the sort of an important point, I think. All this is being done not because it's serving special interests. Special interests rise up behind the system, but it's really the government acting independently to do this in response to the failure to devalue. Of course, there's a lot of other costs here, too. It's not just these deadweight losses of A and B, but depending on how you allocate the imports, if you just cut everyone's foreign exchange budget by 50% and don't auction things off, you get other misallocation losses that can magnify the static deadweight losses from this scheme. And of course, we can think of the other way, too. So that's a case if you have an expansion of import demand. Let's say someone cuts off your foreign aid. Okay, well, then there should be a depreciation of your currency as well. Your trade will go down. You can't afford as much. But what's going to happen is if you don't adjust the exchange rate, you're sort of in the same mess, deadweight loss, rents, and things of that sort. So here's the problem that many countries have faced over time. And the question is, how do they respond to it? You're losing foreign exchange reserves. There's only so many things you can do. You can borrow to finance that gap. Okay? You can only do that for so long. You can deflate, that is, pursue a more contractionary or deflationary monetary or fiscal policy. Well, that means a recession. No politician really likes that. You can devalue. That sort of seems to solve it through a market-oriented way, but that means a higher price level immediately, reduction in real wages. No politicians want to do that. And so option number 4, exchange controls, control import spending. It's arbitrary, creates distortions, but the political cost up front is not so great. But as Kristen Forbes and Michael Klein say, when you have these crises, you just got to pick your poison. None of these are good options. None of these are popular. They do note at the end here, when they look at these, that a sharp currency depreciation can raise GDP growth over time, but with a lagged effect after initial contraction. So that's why politicians don't want to devalue, even though the long-run outcome may be better. In the short run, you have that hurdle. And as Jean-Claude Juncker said, we all know what we have to do. We just don't know how to get reelected once we've done it. That is, you're going to face a recession, so this is not going to work out so well. So let me just give you some examples that will sort of lead us up to this 1980s period. In terms of trade shock, investment expansion, and foreign aid reduction. How did countries respond? So New Zealand, wool exporter. After the Korean War, the price of wool falls. Okay, so export earnings fall quite a bit. This is Walter Nash. He was the finance minister during the interwar period. Now he is the prime minister. And he gave a radio address to the nation about what is going to happen as a result of this fall in the price of wool, which is going to affect their standard of living. He said, here are the options we have. Borrow. Well, we tried that in the 1930s earlier. Interest rates are really high. We're not going to do that again. How about we deflate? Well, that's going to cause unemployment. That's simply not acceptable. We're not going to do that. How about a devaluation? No, we're not going to do that because it's going to raise prices 25 to 30%, and that means inflation instead of exchange prices. How about exchange controls? No, that's too leaky. We're not going to do that. So what are we going to do? Exchange allocation and import selection. So we, the cabinet, are going to determine what we as a country can import and not import through licenses and what have you. And that's exactly what they did. And well into the 1970s, about a third of New Zealand's imports were based on import licenses. It wasn't a very corrupt process, but it severely limited how many imports were allowed in. When did New Zealand get rid of its import licenses? In the mid-1980s, when they floated the dollar. Floated their dollar. They didn't have to worry about the balance of payments constraint. That's getting ahead of the story, though. India. Okay, we've heard about Nehruvian socialism, the second five-year plan, big ramp up in domestic investment. We're going to hurdle what Kuznets said couldn't be hurdled. We're going to become a richer country. So this is in 1956-57. Now, India, as a result of World War II, was flush with foreign exchange. And into the early 1950s, flush with foreign exchange. So what is this? This is how many foreign exchange reserves you have in terms of month of import cover. How many months of imports could you cover with foreign exchange reserves in the bank? The red line there is indicating 3 months, which is what the IMF has standardly said is sort of the minimum you sort of want. It's sort of like even for households, I think, you want 3 months of a paycheck in the bank in case something happens. But they're well above that. They have no problem with foreign exchange. Well, I just showed you what happens with supply and demand when you shift out import demand and you ramp up domestic investment. This is what happened to India. They didn't want to change the exchange rate, so they just blew through their foreign exchange reserves. And by mid-1960s, they're down to 1 month's import cover, which is an incredibly low amount. Here's a political cartoon at the time of the finance minister. And remember that gap between imports and exports that I was talking about? Here he's showing, here's our exchange gap. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the question is, how do you finance that? Well, that first option was what? You borrow. So you send the finance minister around the world pleading for foreign aid to help finance the investment plans of the plan. And here's someone coming back. He's going to get a wreath because he brought back some money to cover the foreign exchange gap. How do they really have to respond? There's only so much you can borrow. So this is from the official history of the Reserve Bank, and the first line there says, almost the first response of the authorities was to impose stringent trade and payments controls. So that's what they're doing. And Nehru says, devaluation, we're ruling it out. Fantastic nonsense. We will not devalue. So how do you allocate foreign exchange for imports? Well, you release something called the Red Book, which comes out every year. It used to be a bestseller in India. Everyone would want to buy it because that told you who you had to go to and what foreign exchange was available for importing any particular good. Consumer good imports were banned. So this is just for capital goods, and it's this thick book that just lists all the things you have to go through to do this. Here's how tight foreign exchange was. Here's a letter from Indira Gandhi, the daughter of the prime minister, pleading with the central bank for £600 to send Rajiv Gandhi to Cambridge for school. Even the daughter of the prime minister had to go to the central bank to request funds to allow future prime minister to, and she was became prime minister too, to get the funds. And it had to go through the process in that way. So after the sort of blowout of demand with the second five-year plan, the black market rate, the parallel market rate goes up. The official exchange rate doesn't change. They're forced to devalue in '66, but notice it doesn't close that gap. And there's still that gap into the 1970s. And if we look at the black market premium on the rupee, in the mid-1960s, it's over 100%. That's incredibly high. That's a huge tax on exporters, a huge implicit subsidy for importers, and the rents are going to be enormous. And if you're one of those lucky few that get an import license, you've made out in a big way. But here's what it does. It taxes trade. So by the mid-1960s, exports for India are about 4% of GDP. This is historically a great trading country, but the trade is being constrained to under 5% of GDP. Very unusual, unnatural condition because the trade restrictions are so large, largely because of the distortions led by the exchange rate. Some countries went in a different way, Korea and Taiwan. Here's where the other shock is reduction of foreign aid and something different happens. So I'll do this quickly so we can get to the 1980s. Black market premium on the Taiwan dollar is very high, but it comes way down. They pursue exchange rate stabilization. Here's the person behind it, S.C. Tsiang, who used to teach at Cornell. He was a student at the London School of Economics, a student of Friedrich Hayek and Lionel Robbins. And he wrote a famous memo, which you can find in the archives in Taiwan, basically describing the creation of a foreign market for foreign exchange. This is the guy who commissioned that report. He implemented it. Exports go. And Taiwan is the first of these outward-oriented Asian countries that really did well as a result of trade. I'd ask you what country this is, but I've already previewed it. What country is this? What city is this? This is Seoul, Korea in the early 1960s. What does Korea export today? Washing machines. What are the people doing there? They're washing their clothes in the river. Why couldn't Korea export in the 1950s and 60s? The black market premium was 150% in the early 1960s. In 1960, Korea's exports were 1% of GDP. 1% of GDP. Imports were about 9% of GDP. How can you afford 9% of imports as a share of GDP and only export 1%? Foreign aid. The U.S. is giving them foreign aid for strategic purposes. By the 1950s, we're done with this, and we say we're cutting you off your foreign aid. How are they going to pay for those imports? So they devalue in the early 1960s. Under a democracy, the U.S. had pressured that. Park Chung-hee comes in. He's not initially in favor of export-led growth. He has a fiscal blowout. The black market premium begins to rise again. What does the U.S. do? The U.S. cuts off foreign aid in the midst of a food shortage in Korea to force them to devalue the won. So you can go through the U.S. archives on this. We're forcing or trying to persuade the Koreans to make a number of difficult decisions, including a devaluation and other things. Here's what happens. They devalue. They move to a more flexible exchange rate regime. The exchange rate premium goes down. Exports begin to go up. Park says this is a good thing because we'll be independent of the U.S. They can't tell us what to do anymore. And so we're going to push exports. We're going to push them up to $1 billion. Sounds like a lot of money. I mean, Dr. No, Dr. Evil would say this is a big sum of money, but it was at the time. Here are the policymakers behind that. It wasn't Park Chung-hee himself who had this idea. It's Chang Ki-young. Where did Chang Ki-young get his ideas? He got them from Kim Chung-young, unfortunately not a Yale, but he had ideas about markets. And what they did is not just devalue, but in 1966, liberalize most of the quantitative restrictions on imports. And of course, the rest is history. South Korea in 1960, today. And of course, a lot of other things going on. Let me just tell you one Yale story on Korea, though. Some of you might remember Gustav Reines, who is a very famous development economist here. He was engaged in a discussion with Joan Robinson of Cambridge about the Korean miracle. And I think this took place in the early 1970s. They're both just saying it's astounding what's happening in Korea. And Gustav later said, about a couple of days later, he said, until it struck me that I was talking about South Korea and she was talking about North Korea. Because she was a socialist, and she wrote this about in the International Socialist magazine on North Korea. And of course, we know the difference between those two countries. Okay, so what's happening here? So leading up to the 1980s, nothing happening on the trade policy reform front. Countries have non-unified exchange rates, meaning they have multiple exchange rates. Huge amounts of black market premia. Why no reform? Well, there's an abundance of foreign exchange. Countries could get away with this. First of all, in the 1970s, a positive terms of trade shock for commodity exporters, generous foreign aid during this period, a lot of international lending with the recycling of the OPEC surpluses. And so there was a sphere floating, you could keep your fixed exchange rate and sort of muddle through. In fact, a Spanish economist said foreign exchange reserves kill the will to reform. When your bank is full, you don't have to do anything. Why did things change in the 80s? We go from a period of foreign exchange abundance to a period of foreign exchange scarcity. There's less international lending, a sharp decline in the terms of trade by the mid-1980s, and big declines in foreign aid from the Soviet Union to Vietnam, to Eastern Europe, to China, and other countries. And what happened is countries began to overcome their fear of floating. They began to appreciate we need to stimulate exports because we're not going to get foreign aid to fill that gap anymore and keep our imports high. We're not going to be able to borrow as much, and we're going to have to export our way out of this. And that's why Krugman says, when we ask why do the developing countries begin to change their policy, it's basically driven by ideas. And as Dane Roderick has also said, part of the problem with our political economy models is we don't have ideas in them. We have special interests, and maybe it's not a special interest sort of story. In fact, it wasn't so much a special interest story. It's really a battle between different government bureaucracies that I'm seeing. Between the central banks wanted freer trade, not because they cared about free trade per se. They didn't want to maintain the fixed exchange rate. They didn't want to have to sweat out how are we going to maintain the foreign exchange reserves we need to maintain the exchange rate. Let's let it go so we can inflation target and do something constructive. So there's a big debate within governments about what to do about the fixed exchange rate. Other agencies said, no, we want to allocate foreign exchange, either for political purposes or we think we can do better. And so here's where ideas matter. So the IMF was very early in thinking overvalued exchange rates are very bad for development. Nice quote from Ernie Sturck, who was head of the ETR department of the IMF, which is very important. He was a Czech delegate to Bretton Woods in 1944, and he says he remembers John Maynard Keynes leading a toast to no more competitive devaluations. And what he says, little did I dream I'd spend the rest of my life telling countries they ought to devalue, because this was a pervasive phenomena of the time. Not everyone thought devaluation was a good idea. So here, even in the mid-1980s, 1983, some economist from Cambridge, Nick Kaldor, says, you know what? Devaluation, it's not going to work out so well. So don't do that, do some other things. We'll see how that played out. Countries begin to move towards more flexible exchange rate regimes. I'm compressing the story here a lot. These overvaluations fall away by the 1990s. So let's see how this played out in a couple of countries. India. So we already talked about how India had this foreign exchange problem in the 1960s. Look at the 70s, no problem. Okay, foreign exchange abundance. But then they run into problems in the early 1990s when it goes back down to where it had been at very low levels. So they have this crisis in 1991. How do they deal with it? They sell gold. You can't do that forever. That's just maintaining that gap for a short period of time. Of course, selling gold, that's sacrilegious in India. You're giving up national treasure. How do they handle it? Import repression, tightening licensing. Look at the prior import deposit requirements. This is what importers have to pay before you can import something. 50%, 133%, up to 200%. Just trying to squeeze import demand until there's a new government that comes in June of 1991. Manmohan Singh is appointed finance minister. Interestingly, he went to Cambridge as an undergraduate, but he had the wisdom to go to Oxford as a graduate student, not Yale. And he wrote his thesis on India's export prospects. And there's one little paragraph in there where he mentions, you know what? A devaluation or a realistic exchange rate might be a useful thing to help conquer the balance payments problems that are chronically affecting India. The seed of that idea lay dormant for many, many years. Of course, there are many others. Jagdish Bhagwati and Padma Desai talking about the distortions of the exchange regime. And here at Yale, of course, TN, a tremendous voice for reform in India. We get reformers in office. Manmohan Singh, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, also Oxford trained, willing to let the exchange rate go and do other things. And so when they're brought into power and empowered by the prime minister to do what it takes to solve this problem, in 4 days, here's what they do. Day 1, devaluation. Day 2, revamp export policy to incentivize exporters and give them access to foreign exchange at the depreciated rate, not the official rate. Day 3, another depreciation of the rupee. Industry divided over this. Special interests weren't being consulted here. Of course, the opposition say depreciation is going to play havoc with the economy. Shouldn't devalue. It's going to be too costly. Day 4, drastic changes in trade policy. Basically, eliminating import licensing. All within the span of 4 days. There's some wonderful memoirs of the policymakers. You can read about this. Montek Singh Ahluwalia said trade policy changed in less than 48 hours, and he talks about exactly how that process worked. And I had the honor and privilege of hosting Montech in Hanover at Pine a number of years ago. He is a true hero for India in terms of the development consequences. But listen to how the Prime Minister speaks about the exchange rate. Why did they devalue when that was a taboo? We did it so we can export more. That earns us foreign exchange. Why do we need foreign exchange so badly? Not to buy import luxuries, but to buy kerosene, oil, capital goods, things to make the economy run, because import compression, it was beginning to run the economy into the ground. And he says, my objective is to make India truly self-reliant. So self-reliance does not mean autarky. It doesn't mean self-sufficiency. What it means is the ability to pay for your imports with your exports. That's why you do the adjustment, and that's what so many other countries did. Manmohan Singh said the same thing. Why are people worried about this devaluation? It's a price. It's not something immoral or anti-national. It's not sinful or dishonorable. That's the way it had been viewed before. If you devalued, you had to resign in disgrace. It's a price. Let the market set the price, and that's exactly what they did. They brought down tariffs from 140%. That was just to sop up rents. It wasn't really limiting trade, but down to 40%. They got rid of quantitative restrictions, not completely, but reduced them dramatically for various categories of goods within a short period of time. And what happened to India's trade? Well, instead of being stuck at 5% of GDP, it goes up to 20% of GDP. It's pretty amazing. What about Mexico? Here's once again where the role of ideas is sort of important, and you can see this at critical junctures. 1982, debt crisis, import repression. 1985, still an import crisis, but you move to freer trade. Why? The team changed. So here's Mexico. Here's their foreign exchange reserves in terms of weeks of import cover. Once again, basically out of reserves in the early 1980s. What do? The initial response is every single import requires a license. You cannot import, you cannot spend any foreign exchange on imports unless you have a license. And we control the size of those licenses, 100%. Why do they do that? Cambridge. Do you detect a theme here? Anjit Singh, Nicholas Calidor saying, don't devalue. That'll lead to inflation. You want to clamp down on imports. So what's the first line? Strict control on imports, foreign exchange curbs, big budget deficits, nationalization of the banks. That's how you get through this. So there's this debate. Martin Wolf, who you might know as the chief financial commentator for the FT, he said, Cambridge economists are deeply dangerous and motivated by dangerous ideas. They're basically preaching catastrophe. And Nicholas Calidor there on the right is saying, you know what? Mexican industry is very inefficient. They couldn't survive and they can't compete under free trade, so you got to clamp down on imports. Of course, he's right. You are going to be competitive at the fixed exchange rate. But at a different exchange rate, your domestic industries won't be less competitive. So under President Lopez Portillo, it was dominated by Cambridge economists. When there's a change of administration in 1982, Miguel de Madrid comes in, and what happens? Economists trained in Yale, Chicago, MIT. Here's the leader of the pack. He didn't get his PhD, but he made more of a contribution than many PhDs by changing policy in Mexico. Miguel Mancera. And here is the network of economists in the administration. Yale, 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 Yale. Yale's all over the place, including your own Ernesto Zedillo, who played a role too, and he's here at Yale, and he's in Spain at the moment. What did these Yaleys do? Boom. They got rid of import licensing. They cut the tariff. And they began to open up the economy. A couple other stories before we conclude. What about China? China's a big story too. I'll have to compress it. One of the major economists who was influential in policy debates was Wu Jinglian, called Market Wu, because he talked about the market a lot. And he was a big advisor to Deng Xiaoping and his successor, Zhu Rongji, who did a lot of the opening in the 1990s. There's a book, a collection of his papers and statements. For my generation, if you made the cover of Time magazine, that was it. I know Time magazine doesn't really exist, but he made the cover of Time magazine. What did they do? In 1994, they unified the exchange rate. There was a big black market premium because there was a lot of inflation after Tiananmen Square. And they had a devaluation, boom, bring down the real exchange rate. And that helped pave the way for removal of other import controls, such as the tariff, which was cut shortly thereafter because you get the right exchange rate. Where did Wu get his ideas? He was trained in China. He spent some time at Yale. He has a fascinating story. He came here for 3 semesters as an exchange student. He was middle-aged. He took the PhD level econ because he was a trained economist in China. Didn't understand a thing. So he went to the master's level classes. Didn't understand them too, so he went down to basic micro and macro, and then he began to realize how a market economy works. He got a vision of the market economy, and he said, you need a market for foreign exchange. Last region, Africa. Black market premia off the charts. Trade incredibly suppressed. So here's Tanzania and Uganda. By 1990, exporting 8% of GDP because these black market premia are just absolutely normal. Foreign exchange cover. How much foreign exchange reserves do you have? 3 months or 15 weeks or so, 13 weeks. Everyone's well below that through most of the 1980s and into the 1990s. They don't have foreign exchange. How do you get these countries? They're surviving on nothing. How do you get them to change? The World Bank keeps giving them loans, saying, we'll buy policy reform. Except that just kept them going. And so finally, the World Bank said, we're cutting you off from aid. What did that do? Chief economist of the World Bank, Michael Bruno, said, we did more for Kenya by cutting off aid for 1 year than by giving them aid for 3 decades, because it forced them to adjust the exchange rate and to begin to move in that direction. Here's Uganda. Very low level of reserves, huge black market premium, trade suppressed. This is the volume of trade down to 10% of what it had been in the early 1970s. Some great books on Uganda. Here's one, once again, not a Yale, unfortunately, but close in Connecticut, who helped reform the foreign exchange system and talked about the corruption. A couple of reports here that talk about the benefits of moving towards a more unified exchange rate. Here's what happens when these reports is known as the Morris reports. And who authored those reports? Stephen Morris, Yale PhD. I think he deserves a round of applause for his contributions to policy reform in Africa. What happened after they listened to him? Foreign exchange reserves go up because exports go up. Look at what happens to exports between 1993 and 94. And it's not just coffee. By 10 years, diversification of exports. It's not just you reinforce your comparative advantage, you allow at a competitive exchange rate many more exports to emerge. And of course, they move in a much better direction. So now there's a big literature on looking at this now in retrospect. So there's now an appreciation that large overvaluations are very detrimental to growth. There's an appreciation that maybe even undercurrencies, there's a debate that undervaluation may lead to promote growth. Reinhardt and Rogoff talk about how unified exchange rates perform much better than multiple exchange rates. Argentine economists have talked about how less flexible exchange rate regimes are associated with lower growth. So we're learning this now. But let me just say that this is really, I think, a big part of the story of the 80s and 90s. It's not just Reagan Thatcher, it's not just ideology, it's practical problems and using markets to solve foreign exchange shortages, which are truly artificial in some sense. This is not just of historical interest because not every country did this. So if we look around the world today, there's still pockets of countries and regions where there's tremendous overvaluation of currencies because central banks want to maintain those fixed rates. Not all crises lead to reform. It depends on the policymakers in place and whether they're educated at Yale or other places like that. So Nigeria, if you go to the Central Bank of Nigeria, and here's an interview with the central bank governor who was in place from 2013 to 2023. He said, isn't your currency overvalued? And the reply was, Nigeria doesn't need to trade. We could close the borders and the economy would do fine. In fact, I'd like to do this. So if that's your approach, you're not going to get very far. Nigeria faces an import crisis as a result. Here's a major oil exporter facing a loss, almost an exhaustion of foreign exchange reserves. Here's Sri Lanka, which we'll hear about tomorrow, running out of foreign exchange reserves. Here's Egypt. Their infinite crisis. Why? Because they continue to peg the price of the Egyptian pound, and they borrow, and the money goes in and goes out, because it's just propping up the dollar, the pound. This was in the Financial Times 2 days ago. Turkey, running out of reserves, thinking about selling gold to prop up its currency. So it's still a problem today, and it's still a view about whether devaluation is an appropriate response to these problems. But I think the rethinking of foreign exchange markets, the role of the exchange rate has proved very important in the past. So I'll close with this. Paul Collier, a great African development economist, I think just said it so succinctly and summed up everything I'm trying to say, that the heart of liberalization is the conversion from using trade policy for payments balance to using the exchange rate. And that frees up trade policy for other things. The fundamental reason for liberalization is export promotion. And I would add the Irwin corollary to this. The fundamental reason for export promotion is to earn the foreign exchange to pay for imports, because otherwise you have that gap. So I want to leave you with 3 last messages. First of all, to the trade economists in the room, I hope that we now can appreciate the importance of the exchange rate, which often does not get into our models, the importance of the exchange rate for thinking about the system of trade that so many countries have. For the graduate students here, I'd say, if you're not from the United States and you plan to return home, there's tremendous opportunities for you to improve the economic performance of your country through wise and sound economic advice. And you never know when your time is going to come and how long you have to wait. So Manmohan Singh, he had to wait 30, 40 years from the time he wrote his thesis to the time he was in a position to influence events. And for those of you studying economic history, this is the biggest subject there is. Why are some countries rich and others poor? And when we look at the traditional things that we economic historians look at, culture, institutions, geography, all these things are incredibly hard to change. But what can be changed? Policy. And I think we underrate sometimes the role of policy in the wealth of nations. Thank you very much, Yale, for all you've done for further economic education.
Thank you, Doug. If you will raise hands, we have 2 of our IDE students, perhaps future central bankers themselves, Jackie and Lakshmi Adithi. We'll pass you a mic.
First of all, thank you for the amazing lecture. It was super insightful and we learned a lot. So during this lecture, you kind of mentioned about the importance of policy and how they can lift some countries out of poverty and they can really shape the economy, the country's economy and everything. In class, we learned about the middle income trap. And I was wondering if policy is able to shape economies, have such a big impact. How did this middle income trap myth or fact or something come out to be?
Well, I think one of the things that's changed from Kuznets' time is that we've seen many more transitions, and we've seen some countries get out of that. So I would refer you to the work of Ricardo Hausmann and Danny Roderick on growth diagnostics and Andres Velasco, because every country is different in terms of the constraints that are restraining economic activity and are a barrier to future progress. So I identified countries where I think trade policy was sort of critical, where the trade ratios were artificially low because of the overvalued currency. But that may not be true for other countries, and there may be other constraints. And there's so many other policies that I'm sure you're learning about in your development classes. So let's say you get the right exchange rate, but your roads are terrible and your ports don't work very efficiently, then you're not going to get the export response. So there are a lot of complementary things that can be done. So every country that's facing a middle income trap, there's always going to be some barriers to riches, as Prescott said, that can be identified and possibly dealt with. So once again, it's not always going to be trade policy, but there's going to be something else where there's some margins on which you can make progress and try to avoid that trap. No one should be shy. I think just because I praised Yale doesn't mean you. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, beg your pardon.
You're first and then up here. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, to speak up. Okay, that's fine. Yeah. You were talking about how, if for PhD students, for example, you can be patient about being in a position to impact the world with what you're learning. I wanted to hear more about how you have been in positions of impacting policy in your life and how you've navigated trying to get to that position.
Oh, I'd say zero.
Zero influence whatsoever. Yeah, I haven't played much of a role in the policy world. I'm a trade person who's really interested in history. And when we're talking about history, we're talking about the past. And so its relevance for the present may not be
Immediately obvious.
so. I'm happy playing in that area. And current policy, I like to observe, but it's purely as an observer. It's not someone trying to shape events or bring the grassroots. But once again, that maybe is slightly too modest. Because I think the power of ideas can be very important. And so, just by understanding the Great Depression, as so many people at Yale, such as Irving Fisher did, helping us to understand things can shape the response. Even if you're not personally responsible for that response. And if you can identify some of the problems that so many countries have, and once again, you don't have to actively work to undo them, but if you just identify them and articulate and forceful, you can have an influence on someone else. So so I'm doing this study of so many countries in the reform process. Most of the economists, they're not on any syllabus. Like Mancera, maybe they just earned a master's and didn't bother to get a PhD because they wanted to go home. We talk about the Chicago boys in Chile. Most of them didn't get their PhD, but the master's was good enough. And they want to improve things in their country. And a little bit of economics goes a long way, because in many countries there's a dearth of economic expertise. So these things can help possibly create community, talking about ideas. So I can go on about that too.
So I'd also like to thank you for your wonderful lecture. You didn't mention that Andres Velasco was a Yaley too, by the way. But anyway, my question.
Andreas was a classmate of mine at Columbia. Because Yale lost Carlos Diaz
Alejandro to Columbia, that Andres came and was a classmate of mine at Columbia.
Okay. So.
And I could go on about Andreas, because he's an amazing guy, because he learned from history, but we'll talk about that.
Okay, he was an amazing guy.
Yeah.
So.
Is.
Yeah. Well, amazing while he was at Yale is what I meant. So.
He was amazing after Yale, too. Yeah.
I have a very just simple question. So why did everything come to this expansion of trade? Why did it all come to a screeching halt? It's not all Trump, I presume. Something else must be happening. What stopped it all?
That's not an economic history question. That's a current events. So first of all, it peaks with the global financial crisis. It collapses and comes back up, and then it's flat. So Penny and so many other people have done work on this. Global value chains sort of stop expanding around this period. The World Bank has sort of identified. There's some protectionist response after the global financial crisis, but not as much as one would think. You could think, that line is not going to, Herb Stein, I don't think it was a Yaley. Herb Stein was a famous economist. He said, something that can't go on forever will stop. And that line was not going to go up forever. So we don't know exactly when it would tail off. But, once China's open, once India's open, there's a sort of a steady state that you're going to reach. I don't know whether we came short of that or what have you. So I think there's a variety of factors that one could throw into the mix. Uncertainty about future trade developments, policy, others have.
Okay, if I can take that.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I wonder if I can ask, I really enjoyed the lecture, I thought it was wonderful. I'm not a trade economist, I study development and energy. What I know from trade at one step removed is that there's a huge sort of industry literature estimating static gains from trade today. We have different assumptions on preferences in technology, and people have been throwing the kitchen sink at it, and there are all these foundational contributions, including by my colleagues. And the punchline to that is the gains from trade in these models are not that large. And then you show us, of course, with the sort of long-run data that in these episodes, think of South Korea, think of India, you're not talking about a 20% increase in income or welfare, you're talking about like many, many folds, five-fold or something over the course of decades. And so obviously there's a lot of stuff that aren't in those short-run models. I could think of two broad classes of stuff. One is that there are these complementary reforms like ports and that kind of thing that are changing, but I guess the broader one, which is more in the spirit of your lecture, the intellectual history that maybe moving to a market for these kinds of things sort of corresponded to or brought along a culture of liberalization that really filtered into the rest of the economy, analogous to the Mokir culture of growth. And like when I go to India in a lot of ways seems more capitalist than the United States nowadays. There's a lot of energy. And so I wonder, what do you make of the difference between the static gains from trade that we see in these models and these massive long-run gains? And what do you think makes up that difference?
That's a huge question and a very important one. And that's why you have not just a great trade group here, but you have the Economic Growth Center, because the two go together in many ways. And you're right, so many of those estimates are static. One period of time, just partial equilibrium shift, maybe general equilibrium, but sort of one-off things. But they don't bring in what Sam Cordham and so many others have talked about: importation of capital goods, borrowing technology, access to technology. And I think one of the things that has impressed me about the reforms that I see is that these channels work, but just expanding what you can import and buying things. First of all, it's not just it's not just the technology and the capital goods, but access to things that you don't produce. So like if you can import cars, you're not going to produce cars, let's say a small country, but you have access to it. The welfare gains are huge, but the GDP measurements or it's not going to be that big. But I do sense from reading memoirs of people and some of the policy memos, these things they're transformative in ways that we don't quite capture in our models, in terms of the dynamism, in terms of new ideas that can be applied in the service sector, non-traded goods and things of that sort. So I think it's just our models simplify things and they miss things. But you're right, there's an essence, a Mokir sort of essence of that opening up does, I think, involve for so many countries. John Stuart Mill has a quote about how the opening of foreign trade leads to, he doesn't use the term the Industrial Revolution, but leads to a revolution in industry. He doesn't mean manufacturing, he means ideas and new concepts, new ways of doing things. And once again, it's sort of a vague thing. We can't really model it very well, but there's something to it at the same time.
So thank you for your speech. So I'm an ID master student here. So actually your speech made me realize that maybe I could just stop here and just make a greater impact in the future. Yeah. So yeah. So actually, my question is, so we talked a lot about opening up markets and floating exchange rate in your speech. And I was just wondering about, do you think it is a necessary condition for developing countries to open up markets? Because it's their developed countries, so they have already been industrialized, and there's a need for
manufacturing goods. So I was wondering like whether this is a necessary condition, because if you imagine like some developed country like open up their markets, say that in early 90s, maybe they are just like developed countries will like buy a lot of raw materials and just flooding in a lot of like industrial and manufacturing goods. Yes, so this might be another trap for like developed countries, well, like in like early 19th centuries. Yeah.
Well, it seems like you could benefit from another year at Yale, because there's so much more to be learned here. And there's a big debate among economists about not just the middle income trap, but premature industrialization. Has manufacturing run its course? Do we need to focus on service sector now, improving service sector productivity? I'd say for many countries, depending on the region, certainly Africa, there's still scope for agriculture to do incredibly well. And once again, you can be an agricultural exporter and be rich. New Zealand, Australia's a mining nation in many sense. They just shut down their last auto plant, so they produce no autos. They've lost their manufacturing sector. So ultimately it comes down to productivity. The question is, where do you get that? Every country is going to be a little bit different, but we do have to look outside manufacturing, because the same old playbook can't be rerun many times. There's still scope for it to run, because one of the charts I have in Free Trade Under Fire, a book you mentioned, is that where Nike produces its shoes. And it looks like these humps where they ramp up in some country, the wages rise, and then they pull out and they move onward. So someday Vietnam's going to lose the shoe industry because they're going to upgrade. And then there's an opportunity for someone else, unless a lot of things can happen in terms of the technology. So once again, growth diagnostics is sort of important. Where are the constraints? Where are the opportunities? It's going to differ for different countries.
Hello? Hello?
Oh, yes, sorry.
Yes, thank you. I walked in a while ago, but I was listening to the lecture on Zoom on my way here, so I'm not sure if you touched on this. I want to ask, maybe it's a follow-up to what the last person asked about developing countries, especially African countries. I know you said a lot of things about Uganda, Nigeria, Kenya. So I want to ask you, in honesty, to what extent do you think that that economic fundamentals have driven, the development trajectory of the African countries? The idea is that the debt crisis, which was an imposition of the Bretton Woods institution, was what pushed these countries into structural adjustment, perhaps ignoring the social and other economic policies that should have been put in place before they start, reforming trade policies, financial policies, and so on. So, in honesty, do you think that these countries could have fared better on their own if they had been allowed to develop at their own pace, looking at their peculiar circumstances, maybe as primary producers, rather than try to jump into industrialization and trade, with the result of a lot of social costs on the majority of the population? So that's, I wanted to address that.
So the first thing I would refer you to is an article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives about 2 or 3 years ago on, it was on Africa, it was on the Washington Consensus. There was a symposium on the Washington Consensus, and there's an article specifically on Africa by some African policymakers and academics rethinking that period. There's no doubt that the 1980s was a horrible, horrible decade for Africa. I think, I would blame African policymakers as much as the Western banks and what have you, because they postponed the adjustment in many instances. So this structural adjustment took place over a decade and a half or so and played out over a long period of time. We see that particularly with respect to Tanzania and some other countries as well. And so, if that gave rise to that Michael Bruno quote about how the foreign aid kept coming in to buy policy change. The change wasn't coming. It's just kicking the can down the road. You know, Uganda's in a much better place than it had been. Kenya as well. And so you saw after the adjustments, you know, at least you get incomes rising. I didn't show you what happened to Ugandan incomes after the mid-1990s when it's growing at like 6% a year. That's not double-digit rates, but that is very good, and that was very stable, and that provided a lot of stability for people when they absolutely needed it. So it was a very difficult transition, but I think and hope that they're in a better place. But there is scope for, once again, people to get educated about how economies work and how the economic system works, and working to implement those policies back home, because every country is going to be different in terms of the constraints and in terms of the challenges that they face and the obstacles.
So first, thank you, Doug, for a great lecture. You made, I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
So you made a very convincing case that the exchange rate policy was the catalyst of export-oriented growth and growth miracles. So and I'm fairly convinced that exchange rates played a very important role, but another hypothesis that I've heard many put forward is, and that applies mostly to more recent times, so not the gold standards, not the Great Depression, is that countries embraced trade liberalization for many reasons, you know, including being part of the WTO or the GATT before that. So they liberalized trade, they reduced import controls, other trade restrictions. And then comes the political economy explanation of liberalizing the exchange rate regime, namely they need to soften the blow to domestic importers. So they liberalize exchange rates, they let the exchange rate value. And that leads to precisely the same outcomes you mentioned. So empirically, trade liberalization and exchange rate liberalization go hand in hand. And it's very hard to say in which direction the causality goes. And so my question is, does it really matter in which direction the causality goes? So is it the finance ministers or the trade ministers we should be giving credit to? I mean, it seems there is a very different mindset where people embrace markets, liberalization, and this creates these growth miracles you talked about. Does it really matter whether it was the exchange rates or the import controls that started this process?
I think it absolutely matters, and I have a view on that, that the causality or the timing is exactly the opposite as you describe it. So I think it's unilateral. Initially to get the devaluation and the reduction in the trade controls, and then come the trade agreements, and then comes joining the GATT or the WTO, because that's the second generation of locking in those initial reforms. So it's not the case that they think we want to join the GATT or the WTO, oh, to do so we have to do this, that, and the other thing. It's that after they've done that and they have the domestic consensus that they want to do that and they see it's working, they say, okay, let's lock this in with the WTO and what have you. So for example, I mean, China is a great example of that. They unified the exchange rate in 1994. They began the tariff reduction process in 1995 in anticipation of they would have to do that to join the WTO. That certainly was the objective, but they had to do the reforms up front. It's not as though the WTO was telling them what their exchange rate policy would be, because that's not really what the WTO does. Same is true in Mexico. So they ultimately had the, so they thought about joining the GATT in the late 1970s. It was rejected because they realized they couldn't with their exchange controls and what have you. And it's when the new Yale regime came in that they said, okay, now we're paving a path to join rather than the other way around. So I have this paper where I look at the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO, and I say which one was most important for trade reform during this period. Because going into that, I thought, well, the WTO does trade, and the World Bank does some trade conditionality loans, and the IMF, that's macro. And after looking at it, I just completely reversed it. Is the IMF that was much more important than the other two institutions, I think, because they were the ones focused on the exchange rate regime and things of that sort. And World Bank, I think I put second, and the WTO actually third, because it's after you've reformed that you're willing to join and sign up for those commitments. You don't sign up and do things because of that. Now, there's an exception because some of the latecomers did sort of clean up everything
when they joined the WTO. That's a little bit after that. So I'd say after 1995. There's some of the stand countries and things of that sort. But in this period that I'm talking about, mid-80s to mid-90s, before the WTO actually, it's largely unilateral.
Hey, Doug, thank you so much. I think we probably need to do a lot more research because I could think of a couple counterexamples that are more in line with what Penny had in mind, right? Like lots of the Asian financial crisis and lots of the crises, the move to floating exchange rate regimes came as an inevitability because they couldn't keep up the other parts of the triangle, right? So I think we need to do more to figure out exactly, on average, how does it go? But I'm curious to hear from you, we are used to floating exchange rate regimes, I think, nowadays. But then we hear the current administration where, talk about trade deficits a lot and the balance of payments. And I wonder, in your opinion, to what historical period are we closest to nowadays? Do you think, is there any threat that the United States is moving to something closer to controlling exchange rate regimes of that kind? And what are your thoughts on it?
I'd say, to be honest, the early 1970s. If you look at the period between 1970 and 1974 in the United States, it was a period of intense trade conflict with something called the Burt-Harkey bill coming up in Congress, mandating quotas on all imports. Well, actually, specifically shoes, apparel, and what have you. So Congress was on the verge of enacting quota legislation. Obviously, we had the import surcharge that Nixon charged to get the foreign currencies to be revalued among Japan and Germany in particular. So there's currency conflict. There was concern about the U.S. going from a current account surplus to deficit. There's talk about quotas and managed trade on a very big scale. And it was only for about 2 or 3 years, but it was very intense 2 or 3 years in which if they had gone down that route, U.S. trade policy history would have been very different. And it sort of passed, and so we don't think about it so much. But the Nixon administration took a very similar view about foreign countries at the time. The Nixon tapes sort of show that. John Connally saying, the dollar's our currency and your problem, saying foreigners are out to screw us. Our job is to screw them first. I mean, that's the Treasury Secretary in the Nixon administration. So there's sort of an anti-ally, anti-foreign, trade as a problem period that we sort of went through for a brief time in the early 1970s. I don't think the Great Depression analogies work very well. I'm working right now in the late 19th century trade regime and how it deteriorated before World War I, because there was a lot of concern about geopolitical tensions, and I don't see the late 19th century regime actually falling apart all that much. So I don't think there are many precedents, and I think the early 1970s was one where there are some historical echoes, if you will, to what's going on today. At least as far as the US. I'm not sure about other countries.
Thank you, Doug, for an amazing lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yale.